Hello, and welcome to the Tired Craftsman channel. I am your host, the Tired Craftsman. This is my co-host, 22. And tonight we have something of a requested project for you. Several of my followers on Instagram have asked for a tutorial on a spring-loaded, wrist-mounted blade device, kind of like John Kramer's in Saw, or Assassin's Creed. And I mean, I get it. I used to use one. Some idiot I shot used to use one. I mean, I personally am more of a ranged attack kind of guy these days, but I understand the appeal. So that's what we're going to make. So the first thing I need to do is make a blade, and since this is going to be a prop blade, I'm going to make it out of aluminum. Using my bandsaw, I cut a 45-degree-ish angle. I'm not really sure, but I like my blades to kind of be reminiscent of a craft knife. I don't know, it's just, I think it's funny. And because cut pieces of aluminum tend to have a bunch of really scratchy burrs, I take the edges that I cut onto a sander for a moment. Now the main piece that's going to make this all work is this drawer slide. It originally came with 3 pieces, but I took the outermost piece off. We only need the middle and the innermost piece. Now to make some modifications to it, we first need to take it apart. You can do that by holding this little sled with these bearings in place and pushing the innermost rail forward, and eventually it will just slide right out. Then I need to cut the outer rail down so that it'll fit the length of my forearm. That'll vary for everybody, but when you're cutting it, make sure that you cut off the just plain metal end. The other side has a plastic piece on it that's going to stop the track from flying out. We need that to stay on. Then we got to take this little sled out, but as you can see, there's 2 little metal tabs at the back of this track holding it in. So I just took a hammer and put it up against an anvil and very, very carefully just tap them down. Also, it is important to note that when you take the sled out, all these little bearings are going to come falling out, so do that in a place where it's easy to collect them all up. Next, I cut a bit off of each side of the inner rail so that it matches the length of the outer rail. We want to get rid of these tabs. Then we need to relocate this little plastic stop that's in the back of it, and to do that, you just drill through the rivet and the little plastic piece will pop right off. And once the piece is detached, we're going to drill a hole at the back of the rail so that we can mount it there later. Also, I forgot to film it, but I cut this little shape into the end of the blade. That's going to be how it locks in place later. And while we're back on the blade for a minute, I took it over the grinder to put a bevel on it to give the illusion of a sharpened edge. Remember, this is just going to be a prop. And now for pretty much the rest of the pieces of this build, we're going to be using this type of aluminum. Using this little compassy divider tool, I scribe out some lines to make an L bracket that's going to be the releasing mechanism. Also, here's a little quick tip for you. If you need to drill holes into a little tiny piece, drill the holes before you cut the piece. Be a lot easier to handle that way. Well, that was easy. And also, while you weren't looking, I cut a few more strips. These are going to make up the cuffs and the length of the part that's going to mount onto my forearm. I've kind of been all over the place with the order of the steps here, but there's going to come a point really soon where it really matters the order you do things in. But before we get to that, I'm just going to take some 220 grit sandpaper and some steel wool and polish up this blade a little bit. Well, not really polish, but you know what I mean, make it look a little bit nicer. Now, I'm going to be honest with you here. I'm concerned that if I try to explain this, I'm just going to make it more complicated. I don't really know what to call all these parts, and I don't expect you to understand the names I make up. So I'm just going to lay it all out so you can kind of see the order that this is all going to come together in. Also, I realize I'm laying out a bunch of aluminum pieces on a piece of aluminum, so that's got to be kind of hard to see. These are the details that I will be more mindful of in the future. I apologize. Anyway, remember that plastic bit that we drilled off earlier? We're going to cut a little bit off of it because if you leave the whole thing on, it kind of makes the blade stop too early, and it's weird. I don't really know why, but trust me. And now to start putting this all together, we're going to use some aluminum rivets that I held upside down by accident. And the first part I'm going to attach is this little piece that I cut that's going to act as an anchor point for the spring that is going to pull the blade down. So I drill a couple holes, I'm going to put 2 rivets in there to keep it secure. Now we can start putting the track onto the blade, and I'm going to use 1 rivet to hold the plastic part that we took off earlier, the innermost part of the track, and the blade all together. Also, I think I forgot to film this part, but you can see that there is another rivet kind of at the end of the black piece there. You want to put 2 rivets on the track and the blade just so the blade doesn't pivot around. Also, now's as good a time as any to mention the slide that I took out earlier. I cut it in half, and we're only going to be using 1/2. Now, an issue that I've sometimes had on projects like this in the past is once you cut this slide down, I found that it doesn't always move across the rail in the position that it's supposed to, meaning that the blade can extend, but the slide doesn't always come all the way down to the end, and if it doesn't, the blade can dislodge and fly out. And since there's a spring attached to the blade and the end of the mechanism, it will swing back and stab you in the arm. So I have found that sometimes you need to put a rivet halfway down the track, that attaching it to the brace there, that will keep the sled from moving back too far, so that when the blade goes forward, it will move the distance that it needs to move. Does that make sense? I think that makes sense. Now luckily, right after I put this first rivet in, I realized I was getting ahead of myself and skipping a step. So before we fasten this down with another rivet, we're going to pivot it to the side and we're going to put on the cuffs that are going to secure it onto my arm. Now luckily aluminum is really soft, so shaping the cuffs isn't too hard. I used my hands to bend it a little bit, but that didn't quite get it to where I wanted to be, so I did have to take it to the anvil in the end and use a rubber hammer to finish it off and kind of smooth out those bends. Then once that's done, I used some leather rivets to attach the cuffs onto the brace. And now with the cuffs on, I can put a couple rivets at the back of the rail to mount it permanently onto the brace. And now we can put the sled and the bearings back in, and to do that, I find it's best to put the two bearings in at a time, push the slide in just a little bit, and then put some more bearings in and just repeat that process until the whole thing is inserted. Then to attach the blade, just slide it back into the sled coming in through the back of the mount. And now that the blade's on, we can attach the spring. I'm going to be using that kind of spring, so now you know. The spring has these little hooks on each end, so it makes it pretty easy to attach it to that anchor point at the back of the blade, and then I'm going to attach the other end to the front by my wrist using a little bolt. And you could cut this bolt down a little bit so it's not sticking out so far, but I'm not gonna right now. Then using 3 more bolts and a few washers, I'm going to put together the release mechanism. It's probably best if you just watch this part, it'll probably make more sense that way. So just check it out. So that's pretty straightforward, right? The front bolt catches the blade, it pivots on the middle one, and the back one is going to be where we tie some rope so that you can trigger it via wrist movement. But before we do that, I would like to add one more small spring to the release mechanism to help it reset easier. Problem is we don't have enough surface area on the brace, so I'm going to take this little piece of aluminum, put a couple of rivets to hold it in, and we're going to put a bolt there to attach the other end of this spring. And because wearing metal can be really uncomfortable, I'm going to use a few pieces of craft foam and some contact cement to put some padding into this. And after that's done, just take some string, tie one end to the locking mechanism, and tie the other end to your finger. Usually I would take a piece of metal tubing and JB weld it down the side of the track and run the rope through it just to keep it more secure. I only have a little bit of metal tube left though, and I need to save that for something else, so I didn't do it for this, but I'd recommend it. But as you can see, it still works well. So hopefully I conveyed all that in a way that was helpful and easy to follow. I feel like this is going to become my regular disclaimer, but if you make one of these, even if it's a prop, don't go walking down the street with it just wherever you want in public. It's not a good idea. If you decide to make it with a real blade, please make sure it is legal in your area. And please, always be careful when you make a spring-loaded thing out of metal, especially when it is stupidly strapped to your body, because it can be dangerous. Alright, I've said my piece. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and until next time, don't stab yourself.